very much indeed, Lascan Corla, and I'm very glad to be able to take part in this debate and listen to statements on the development of our Climate Action Plan 2023, which was presented by government just before the Christmas break, I'm very glad that we have this opportunity to review it, and we will continue to do so as we implement it in the coming year and continue to evolve it to meet what is the greatest challenge of our time, to protect the stability of our climate system for future generations and to avoid the worst impacts of climate change that's already, we know, inevitable because of the change that's happening in our atmosphere. We've known the science of this for absolute clarity for about 35 more years, and going back to that period in the late 80s, the concentration of CO2 equivalent in the atmosphere, greenhouse gases, was some 350 parts per million. It took a number of years for us, the world, to start addressing the reality of that science. A key moment in that was in 2015, in the signing of the Paris Climate Agreement, when 193 countries came together to commit to do what it would take to stabilise our climate. And doing so with all sorts of risks in terms of avoiding crossing over tipping points, which would see runaway climate change. When that was agreed back only 8 years ago, the concentration of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere had gone up to about 400 parts per million. And the frightening thing that raises alarm and the need for action is that today it's just short of 420 parts per million. We are not going in the right direction. The scale of change has not been delivered. We have to act now. This decade is the critical decade. And what that Paris Climate Agreement said, to reduce the risk of runaway climate change, we have to keep the global average temperature below 1.5 degrees. We have to go net zero by the middle of this century. And for a country like Ireland, a developed country, that means we have to halve our emissions this decade and be net zero by 2050. If you look back again, and just to review, because it's important to know where we're coming from this, the initial legislation for a climate law, Climate Act, was set out in the 2015 Act, and a first climate plan for 2017. But there was, I think, an appropriate and a correct Supreme Court judgment saying that that actually hadn't sufficiently addressed the scale of change we needed to make. And it was on the back of that, and also the Citizens' Assembly, which was established back in 2017, that we started on the path which brings us to this plan that we have today. A joint Oireachtas committee, all parties committing in 2018 to really much more ambitious approach to how we reduce our emissions. In 2019, under Minister Bruton, who deserves credit, I think, for the broad approach that he initiated then, which we are still following, where we look at every aspect of the approach that we need to take in government and set clear actions and timelines that we need to do to meet the objectives. The programme for government was established with climate as part of the three central ambitions in government: to address the housing crisis, to bring reform in our healthcare systems, and to show leadership in delivering climate action and reductions. We followed the science. We stuck to what the Paris Climate Agreement said we would have to do. In our case, roughly a 7% per annum reduction. It's based on 2018 reduction from that period, because that was the period in our entering and signing of that programme for government that we had the latest statistics for. So that's the broad context within which this plan is set out. There's been significant progress within this government in first of all, the devising of a much more thorough, a much more powerful 2021 Climate Action and Low Carbon Development Act, a legislation I think that by any analysis would be seen globally as the most ambitious or the most rigorous in terms of holding government to account, requiring in the way it's set out both a long-term vision but also this iterative evolving plan where there are sectoral targets that each minister responsible for their area has to show how we're meeting the overall targets. And since that period, the development in the summer of last summer, 2022, of, as required under the law, the sectoral emissions targets for each sector, going in ambition from the likes of the electricity sector, some 75% reduction in emissions, transport some 50%, industry varied between 40% and 35%, down to agriculture 25%. So we're clear as to what each sector, the responsibilities they have. And the Climate Action Plan, agreed just before Christmas by the government, then turns those sectoral targets into specific measures in each of those sectors that we have to show can deliver the reductions we need. There's one exception, and this has been debated at length in this House over the last year or so, is with regard to land use and land use change, LULUCF emissions, where we committed this year to developing the scientific information we need to be able to make the further reductions that are needed there for us to be able to meet our overall reduction target. I prefer to have that done at the same time that the other sectoral emission ceilings were being set, but we didn't have and don't have the information available for us to know exactly how we could or would do that, and that's why it was more appropriate, as I said, to carry out that scientific analysis as part of the land use review, which I might come back to later, to make sure that what we're setting out is credible, is achievable, is based on good science. That is the only way we're going to be able to address this incredibly complex and challenging issue effectively. I want, if I can, to very briefly, and I think the key, and I said this is an iterative process, it's one where the plan will evolve each year, additional information, additional measures, changing circumstances, reacting to what's actually happening, means that it's a plan which is due to be revised, has been revised each year and will be revised each year, which is the nature of the approach that we're taking. I think that's the right way, rather than setting a 10 or 20-year plan and not actually taking into account what is happening. The key developments in this iteration of the plan, which is much more significant because it now has all the legal force of the 2021 Climate Act behind it. But the key developments, in my mind, in terms of assessing the report, are in chapters 12, 13, 14, 15 and 16, which I want to concentrate my own contribution on. The plans within electricity industry, built environment, transport and agriculture. And I'm going to very briefly, in the time I have, just go over some of the key commitments in this, but they are, I think, they frame what's going to be our whole economy in the coming years, how we're going to have to deliver this as a just transition will be fought out and will be set right in how we deliver these significant measures. Firstly, in electricity, which has the highest reduction, as I said, based on what is achievable, but also what's in our interests in terms of security of the country, as well as the economic development of our country, not to be reliant on expensive imported fossil fuels, to instead rely on our own resources. And this commitment to go from some 5 gigawatts today of onshore wind to 6 in 2025, and then 9 gigawatts of onshore wind is critical. As we know we can do this. We know we have competitive advantage. It's sensitive around planning and other local community issues, but that is a development we need to get right. The large part of the new power, in my expectation, will be delivered by the likes of Coillte, Bordemone and others, in terms of some of the land bank areas in the Midlands and elsewhere where we can do this in a sensitive way, where we can work with local communities. At the same time, and this is a significant change and development from previous plans, we're setting a target within the next 3 years, incredibly challenging, to go to 5 gigawatts of solar power and some 8 gigawatts by 2030. And if you look in the last 20 years, we probably haven't developed we hardly developed any solar power. In the last year, we started to ramp it up to 300 megawatts. That's going to increase and go exponential increase in coming years as we put solar on our school rooftops, as people's solar homes starts to be deployed, but also solar in the field is developed at scale. We need that level of deployment if we're to meet our targets. If we're to meet both our interim 2025 target under the 3 5-year budgeting framework, but also to reduce the cost to Irish consumers and householders. That is a key, critical, new development that's going to require huge effort for us to deliver it, but we can and will do that. Similarly, the development this decade of 7 gigawatts of offshore wind, some 5 gigawatts in the phase 1 and phase 2 projects we expect largely in the east coast and then moving into southern and western waters, but also the deployment of offshore wind for the conversion of energy into hydrogen or ammonia or other molecules which will give us a storage capability and an export capability which is central to our economic future, not just an environmental future. And fourthly, in this renewable electricity future, we will also require 2 gigawatts of further gas power infrastructure to be able, in those periods, the likes of what happened before Christmas, or indeed this week in cold, high-pressure conditions, that we have the backup power to meet our energy needs. That will only be one component in it. A significant role will be played by batteries, pump storage, demand management flexibility, the use of our smart metering, and the use of some of the solutions in the other areas, in transport and in heating, to give us storage capabilities and backup flexibilities. This is the new industrial revolution of our time. We are good at it. As a country, we're one of the leading countries in the world at integrating renewable power into a synchronized electricity grid system. So we need to use that expertise and that advantage and the capabilities we have in EirGrid, in ESB, as well as in the private sector, in Bord Ammonia, in Quilcha and other state companies, to make this happen. Secondly, in industry, and as I said, this is a choice that we need to make, first of all, because of our national climate law, but secondly, in European law. There's some 20 pieces of legislation going through the European Council and Parliament trialogue process with the Commission at the moment, which will transform the European economy in this more digital, low-carbon, green future, which the Union is setting us on. There's even actually higher targets, if you look at it, than the ones set out in national law. So we have to do this for Irish legal reasons, to be part of the European solution, but also thirdly, I would say, where there isn't an option not to take this route, is that the industrial sector and the business sector is also going in this direction. And we'll look to work with governments and with communities which are successful or which are set themselves in the same path. And so in industry, particularly in the area of heat, which has tended to be the area that doesn't get the attention, but it's the one where we need to focus on now most to meet our targets, I believe there's an inevitable transition happening that we need to lead and accelerate rather than trying to resist and hold back. It will deploy the use of heat pumps, as well as them being used in our homes, in industry, for any high-grade heat beneath maybe 200-degree temperature heat requirement. I see heat pumps switching away from, I see us switching away from the use of fossil fuels. We need to switch towards heat pumps instead. Over 50% by the middle of this decade, up to 3/4 of new heat or of heating sources coming from that sort of supply by the end of this decade. We've everything to gain from that. There's huge efficiencies, there's huge competitive advantage, but it's a transition that has to start and happen now. And secondly, in this responsibility of the industry sector, particularly in the construction sector, I see the development of higher quantities of clinker within cement production as one of the other ways where we get significant reduction in the CO2 emissions from the construction sector, industry. And also we have to really work on the percentage of embodied carbon within our building sector. The use of cross-laminated wood products and other embodied carbon systems in our building. It's not just we have to build all these houses and all for our people, we also need to start building with timber in a new and different way, a more circular economy way that embodies the carbon in our buildings in a way that by the end of this decade, up to 30% of the emissions reductions can come from that sort of approach. Lastly, in this industrial sector, the whole emphasis will be on efficiency, on this circular economy, which, as I said, is the centre of the European Union strategy. The Energy Efficiency Directive, as well as the Renewables Directive that's been agreed by the Council already, is going to steer us in that direction. We need to go with it rather than resist it. That's the future, best, most secure, stable economy for our country. In built environment, and I know I'm going very fleetingly through these key areas, but this was the key part of the substance of discussion within government in this plan as to how we get this right. And we know that we have to, in the coming years, go to net zero and then zero emission buildings so that our buildings, as I said, are part of the solution rather than part of the problem. This is all doable. The technology exists, again, in domestic heat pumps, but also in better insulation and better air quality, air management systems, ventilation systems within our homes. We have everything to gain from this. It will not work if it's seen as a punitive kind of negative story. It is about actually creating healthier homes. It is the social justice project of our time, because by retrofitting our houses, as we plan to do in a systematic way, we will end up in a country where we can tackle energy poverty in that way, tackling it at source by making sure that our buildings are fit for purpose, they're healthier, particularly our social housing stock, and those in lower incomes, they're the ones we will prioritise within our retrofit programmes, which are working. We're on target. We introduced that scheme last February, in terms of a really innovative and really extensive, with very widespread grants in February last year. It's delivering. We met our target of 27,000 houses to be retrofitted last year. We will meet it again this year as we ramped that up to some 37,000. Simon Harris yesterday showing that there's been a huge uptick in the number of people looking to go into work in the industry. We've put 2,000 people through the training and apprenticeship programs that will help them get into this industry already, and we're only starting, we're only warming up. This is going to work because it's systematic over 30 years. The funding is guaranteed. It's there through the application of the carbon tax, as well as a whole range of other different measures. And that gives the signal to our young people, as well as to householders, that this is the way to go. Fourthly, and I'm conscious of time, because so I can only address these in very short details, but look forward to further debates in this House as we start to deliver this. Transport is, I think, the sector where we perhaps have the biggest challenge, because we have a problem that we've embodied in the last 50 years of a car-orientated transport system, where with a sprawled housing development pattern and models, where it's very difficult to achieve a low-carbon system. And it's a revolutionary change we're looking at in transport, where we go back to bring life and housing and activities back into the centre of villages, towns and cities, so we reduce the overall volume of transport, where we make an absolute quantum shift away from dependency on private cars. And it's not been anti-car, or it's not in any way blaming any individual in whatever lifestyle or daily choices they have to make, but it's recognising that if everyone is driving, it's not going to work for everyone, because our roads get clogged. You cannot possibly keep up with that. In fact, the more you try to provide solutions by providing more road space, the more in-use traffic you have, and you're into a vicious cycle downwards. We need to change that to a virtuous one, and that's what this plan sets out to do. We do that, as I said, by reducing the volume of traffic. Some 20% reduction in car kilometres is the target we're setting ourselves, and we will introduce the measures to deliver that, because failing is not an option, ignoring the problem is not an option. Transport, like every other sector, has to play its part. We do that with a 50% increase, at least. I expect actually for it to go further in active travel, because when we create a safe space in our streets and roads, which we have not done, we've created a hostile environment which is scaring people away from the active travel solutions, which sees 30% of our morning traffic being children being driven to school rather than being able to get there in other more sustainable and better methods for them and to their families. That has to change. Similarly, the increase in public transport and what will be needed as we wait, unfortunately, because it does take time to build the big rail-based solutions, we will introduce demand management measures through road space reallocation and parking strategies, which provide the space that the buses need to get through the traffic quicker, so it works for everyone. That will not be easy. It will require real courage and commitment in local car authorities across this country, but they too, under the law, have to now react. They have to develop their plans in tune with what the overall climate plan says we need, and that's what we're going to do to deliver the change in transport as well as in all the other sectors. Lastly, and I have only a minute which will not give full justice to the whole aspect, agriculture too has to play its part, and I believe it will do so and achieve further and more, because it's going to be good for Irish agriculture. Reducing our use of fertilisers is essential to meet our climate targets, but also it will save farmers money. We will be moving towards a less intensive system, but I believe we can get paid a higher price for that. There will be a smaller national herd, but the critical thing for farmers is what's their family income and how do we protect the family farm as we do this. We increase their income by investing in anaerobic digestion. We increase their income by supporting moves to diversification towards tillage and other sectors. We increase their income by bringing income from forestry as well as from solar power, as I mentioned earlier. And lastly, in terms of the key project for this year, it's the advancement of the land use review, which will give us a steer in terms of how we make the further reductions in land use, but also how we implement the nature restoration law here, how we deliver the type of forestry we need to restore biodiversity as well as reduce emissions, how we actually protect and see rural Ireland thrive in a low-carbon future, which is possible, which is essential for this country's future and the security and future of our children. Thank you.